everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of the renamed series Beyond Horizons, my cinematic playthrough of Kerbal Space Program. This is our final mission before heading off to Juno. We're using the Hawk shuttle to take up Bebin, Elming, Jolford, and Cerbus to the Valkyrie. These 4 Kerbals will be sacrificing the next year or so of their lives heading to the dusty red planet, and some of the lucky ones may even end up on its surface. Alternatively, they might all end up very unlucky and die of radiation poisoning in interplanetary space, which I really hope doesn't happen. But don't worry, I'm not just leaving it to chance, so I've put lots of those habitation modules, the hitchhiker's canisters, I think is what they're called. Each of these has a med bay on it, and so I've got enough for each Kerbal, so if it really comes to it, every single Kerbal can be in a med bay, and that should hopefully mitigate some of the rather dire consequences of radiation poisoning. Yeah, in real life, solar radiation is a significant problem, and not even just solar radiation, cosmic radiation as well can be. But it's actually a huge limiting factor for manned space missions beyond the Earth's sphere of influence. I mean, the sun itself is giving out tens of particles per square centimeter, and these particles can be traveling hundreds of kilometers a second. A paper released this year called Cosmic Kidney Disease, an integrated panomic physiological and morphological study into the spaceflight-induced renal dysfunction. Yes, a very catchy name. But it's an in-depth look into how microgravity and galactic cosmic radiation affect the kidneys, and yeah, it's not good. It should be noted that they only really did these experiments in low Earth orbit and with computer simulations, so there is a bit of a pinch of salt to be taken there. But these simulations found that the damage to the kidneys is irreversible, which means if we sent a crewed mission to Mars, by the time they come back, they could be on dialysis for the rest of their lives. But our Kerbals don't have to worry too much about that, because I'm not even sure they've got kidneys. Anyway, with the crew transfer complete, it's time to send the Hawk home. And with that risky landing at a foggy runway, it's time to depart for Juno. So here's the Valkyrie. I'm just making the maneuver node to get our encounter with Juno. Now the reason you want to wait for a transfer window is because this is the most efficient time to head to the planet. You see, all I had to do there is burn prograde. Here you see me trying to get the ship in orientation ahead of time, and it took an absolute age to turn. I actually did some calculations, and I figured that it would take around 10.5 minutes to complete one full rotation, which I barely have the patience for. Yeah, this is a big, heavy craft, and I really have not put enough reaction wheels on it to be turning fast. But here we are approaching our maneuver node. Now, the thrust-to-weight ratio on this ship is also quite bad. It's around 0.28, which means it takes a very long time to make burns, which is a bit of a problem when I'm trying to execute maneuver nodes with this vessel. So a maneuver node kind of assumes that all of your velocity will change by the time of the maneuver node, and actually a better representation is that all of your velocity will change instantaneously in the moment of the maneuver node, which isn't really how spacecraft work. So to compensate, I burn halfway before my maneuver node and halfway after it, if that makes sense. So to put some numbers on it, the burn takes 6 minutes and 6 seconds to fully execute, so I'll wait 3 minutes and 3 seconds before the maneuver node and start burning then. So then I'm burning 3 minutes before my maneuver node and 3 minutes after, and this way I can try and keep my my trajectory as close to the maneuver as possible. Unfortunately, all of the burns to Juno have to happen on the nighttime side. Again, we're using the motion of our orbit around Kerbal to kind of give us an extra kick in solar orbit. That way we end up in a higher solar orbit rather than a lower one, because if we go in a lower one, we won't end up at Juno. So yeah, I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to see. I've recently been messing around with different ToughX profiles, which kind of help the visual mods know how to do the lighting. It's really hard to strike that balance between looking good and realistic and still being able to see in the dark, because obviously in real life the darkness of space is very, very dark. So when you're in Earth's shadow or the moon's shadow or even in a spacecraft shadow, it's pretty much pitch black and very hard to see, and some of the visual profiles do mimic that very well, which looks very cool but doesn't make for good videos. But here we are, we're just finishing our burn to Juno, and we've got our encounter. So the next thing to do is create a course correction burn halfway through, just so that we can get into a nice equatorial orbit around Juno, which will make it a lot easier for all the different vessels to rendezvous. Next up we have Hela, the lander for Juno, so we are making our maneuver node to get an encounter with Juno there. Like I said, I had to use some of the transfer stage to circularize the orbit when launching this thing, so here I'm having a quick little look at my Delta V map just to make sure I can in fact make it to Juno, and it's going to be tight. It's going to be very tight. I don't actually know if we'll be able to circularize. If not, then, well, I guess we're not going to the surface of Juno, but hopefully we can at least go to Ike. If we are lucky enough to actually be able to get an orbit around Juno, it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, because we can always go and get it with the Valkyrie or even the pod lander, so I'm just hoping we can at least get to orbit around Juno. That would be the main thing. Yeah, so that Delta V map is actually a mod. That's, I can't remember what it's called, OPM Delta V map or something. It just puts it in the KSP Wikipedia on the game there, just so that I can always make sure I know how much Delta V I've got and whether I can actually get to where I'm going. Here you can see me messing around with a maneuver node to see if we can use the gravitational influence of Ike to help capture us into Juno orbit, but it really depends. When we get there, we'll have to have a play around with that a bit more, I think. And last but not least, it's time to send off Pod 2, which is the lander designed to go to Juno's moon, Ike. And I won't lie, it's pretty much exactly the same as the last two maneuvers, so we'll just speed through it very quickly. Speaking of mods before, I did get someone ask me how I get my mods installed, and honestly I use CCAN. If you want to install lots of mods, I would really recommend using CCAN. It's kind of like a application that does it all for you, has a list of all the up-to-date mods, and you just click which ones you want, you click apply, and it installs it for you, and you don't have to worry about, well, installing them incorrectly or something. There we are, just making our course correction maneuver so we can get a nice equatorial orbit around Juno. All of these course correction maneuvers are roughly 90 days away, so it'll be quite some time before we check back in with them, although I should really keep an eye on the Valkyrie to make sure they don't, well, go crazy, or get poisoned, or, you know, die some other horrible way. So I've made some modifications to the Hawk. After flying back from the Valkyrie, I realised there's quite a few things I wanted to change. So the first thing I've changed are the engines. I've switched to the Weasley engines just because they're a little bit more fuel efficient, and I never really used the turbo mode on the Panthers anyway. I've also messed around with the RCS ports just to make them a bit more aerodynamic, and I've spent a painful amount of time tweaking the centre of lift and the centre of mass to make sure that it can fly perfectly. And I've also changed the colour of some of the fuel tanks there just to give it some nice cool trims. Speaking of the centre of lift and centre of mass, when I was doing this test flight I got so caught up in creating cool cinematic shots that well, as you're about to see, I ran out of fuel. There we are, the engines flame out there, and I realised this is probably a really good opportunity to test how well this thing glides. So with a distance of about 12 kilometers and a height of about 2 kilometers, that gives us a descent profile of about 9.5 degrees. But unfortunately, I didn't have time to do the maths. I kind of had to fly by the seat of my pants. So yeah, I didn't really quite do this perfectly. I really thought I could make it. I tried to pick up a bit of speed by nosing down. But unfortunately, this thing slows down too fast and doesn't pick up speed very fast. So I suspect that the docking port on the back there provides a substantial amount of drag. So yeah, I was just short of the runway and I had to ditch it between the trees there. But overall, it flies really well, just provided there's fuel in the tanks. So we'll hopefully be using this for bigger missions in future. So, as I mentioned before, the Hawk shuttle ends up with quite a lot of Delta V left in orbit, and I figured that might make it quite a good transfer for the moon and back. Now, it doesn't quite have enough fuel on its own to do that, so it will need to refuel in low Kerbal orbit, so that's what we're launching here. So, this is Tavern 1, where weary space travellers can come in for a nice pint and a refuel of their spacecraft. Not that I condone drinking alcohol and piloting spaceships, because that probably wouldn't end very well. But yeah, this is an orbital refuel station. It's not really designed for habitation. It does have a little bit of crew space there and some life support, but it's not really rated to hold crew for any particularly long time. The aim is to use this as a means of getting the Hawk shuttle out to the moon and back, so hopefully, well, we can start testing that soon. Like any good pub, it's going to require a delivery of kegs, and that is what we have here. I've come to realise that a lot of my cinematics in this playthrough consist of, well, something like this, just a launch into low Kerbal orbit, and while it does look beautiful every time, I worry it gets a little bit stale after a while, but let me know if you are enjoying this, or I will try and do a bit more interesting cinematics, especially when we get more space infrastructure set up so we can start darting around the local Kerbal system a bit easier, and maybe even the solar system. Or, well, I should say Kerbal system. But yeah, I'd love to hear your feedback on whether you want to see more launches or less launches. So just leave a comment if you have any opinion at all. Back to the keg, we had a little mishap during the launch here. One of the solid rocket boosters, one of the SRBs, detached and blew up one of our engines. Yes, even with the separation motors to try and pull them away from the craft, it still ended up making contact with the engines and destroying it. But luckily, it had plenty of fuel and plenty of thrust to get itself into orbit anyway, and had fairly good attitude control, so we didn't spin out of control. Yes, my heart sank when I saw that explosion, and I was worried that I would have to ditch the keg and launch another one. But luckily, we got away with it this time. And there it is, the keg full of precious, precious beer. I mean, fuel. Yeah, it does kind of look like a bomb. That wasn't intentional. I just needed it to be aerodynamic, because as you can see, there's some parachutes on this thing. So when it finally runs out of fuel, we'll just deorbit it, go and collect it, and send up a new one. So it should be pretty easy to maintain this station. Yeah, so you just saw me putting some fuel from the keg into the orbital tug. I didn't have enough fuel to actually get it rendezvoused with the station, so I think it's quite fitting that the first vessel that this thing refuels is its own orbital tug. Yeah, so I've said before that normally when I build a vessel in orbit that requires a big heavy fuel tank like this, I will launch the fuel tank first. But in this case, because I wanted to make the maintenance of this station a lot easier, I had to get used to the idea that actually I'd be sending up a fuel tank to dock with the station rather than the other way around. So I had to do it the hard way instead and maneuver this very, very large vehicle to the station, and it moves like a snail because these RCS thrusters aren't very powerful, and the keg is very heavy. So to make the docking process a little easier, I reoriented the main station to face the keg and then oriented the keg to face the station, and essentially they can just head towards each other and no lateral movement is required. Normally I try not to do this if I can help it, because it's not very realistic. It's like sending up a Dragon capsule to the ISS and then turning the whole station just to face the tiny little capsule, but in this case I wanted it to be easier rather than realistic. And with that, the tavern is finished and open for business. That is all I have for today's episode, so thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the channel. And if you want to catch up with older episodes, you can check out the playlist that this is in. But with all that said, I've been Moonfish1001, and I will see you in the next episode.